This is The Second Studio, hosted by the Architecture and Design Office fame. My name is David Lee, and with me is Marina Borderonay. This week, our guest is Michael Tyre.
Michael is Principal, President-elect, and Design Director at Amenta, an architecture firm based in Hartford, Connecticut.
Yes, they also have offices in Boston and New York, I believe. With Michael, we talk about, of course, his early interest in architecture, studying architecture, and then most importantly, the main subject of the conversation, which is neurodiversity in design and architecture. You might be wondering, what is neurodiversity? Well, you're just going to have to listen to find out.
Yeah, you're going to learn something today.
Neurodiversity and basically how he and his office designs for a neurodiverse population of people. And we talk specifically about educational spaces, classrooms, and what does it mean to design a classroom with these, with all of this in mind, and their particular concept of fixed variation as a solution for designing spaces with these considerations. And that's basically the bulk of the conversation. It's super fascinating. Michael's also incredibly well-spoken, has some really interesting ideas.
Yeah.
And I think I personally appreciate it, and I think you guys will too, as the audience. He talks about his journey as an architect, kind of transitioning from being a more, let's call it traditional architect, to practicing now in this new way where it's more about co-creation and thinking about this, all these other factors at play.
Yeah, and actually the neurodiversity in design is a very interesting topic that I think anyone listening to this recording would learn about and find very helpful for pretty much any kind of project. Doesn't have to be educational.
Sponsors.
Are you tired of juggling multiple pieces of software and struggling with spreadsheets that aren't made for the realities of design and architecture in 2023? Built by and for designers and architects, Programma's all-in-one suite of tools has everything modern studios need for every stage of a project. Mood boards, the world's best specification tools, procurement tracking, project management, and more. All smartly integrated, easily shareable, and always up-to-date, reducing time-consuming double handling and costly errors. Share your work in various formats, from PDF to client-friendly, up-to-date online dashboards. Join the ranks of leading studios using Programma today. Click the Programma link in our show notes to start for free. If you're starting to laser scan your renovation projects for accurate as-builts, a client at some point has probably handed you some wonky CAD drawings from 17 years ago. Enter Integrated Projects, or IPX for short. IPX is a scan-to-BIM platform that converts your 3D point cloud file from any major LiDAR camera into standardized BIM and CAD files. The best part is that their website lays out the price and turnaround time instantly. Start that interior renovation project on the 50-yard line with accurate drawings in 3D and 2D. Click the IPX link in our show notes to get your first instant quote.
The Second Studio podcast is made possible by support from Autodesk. Autodesk has been part of the design conversation since 1982, providing the tools that help architects around the globe imagine and create beautifully designed, memorable buildings that people love and admire.
Autodesk supports the work of the Second Studio, bringing the architecture community together, sparking curiosity, and leading vibrant interviews with the industry's visionaries and thought leaders. The Second Studio works hard to carry the architecture conversation forward, and Autodesk is proud to contribute to this podcast. You can learn more about Autodesk by clicking on the link in the episode notes.
This is The Second Studio with myself, Marina, and our guest, Michael Tyre. Here we go.
I grew up in a suburb of Miami called Homestead, Florida. And so I've had kind of a reverse migration to the Northeast as an adult. I went backwards compared to everyone else, it seems. But yeah, I think I didn't know I wanted to be an architect right away, but I certainly had all the telltale interests that probably many architects do. Legos, one of which you mentioned, fort building, all these kinds of things. And I certainly always loved drawing. Drawing has always been like a fascination and love of mine. And I also had this weird penchant for taking things apart when I was a kid. I was fascinated by taking things apart and looking inside them, like the stereo and the cassette player and the television and the microwave. And much to my parents' chagrin, but I was always fascinated by looking inside things and seeing how they worked. And I remember the Swatch watches came out and they were clear and you could see all the gears. And that fascination, it made sense to me later in being an architect that of course, these drawings that we do are effectively looking inside something. cutting a view and seeing what's inside. So yeah, I had a lot of the probably signs and interest. And I think that it wasn't maybe until I was like in 8th grade, I think I had a class in middle school that involved like drafting and some architecture design. And that's when I was like, oh, this is a thing. I like this. And probably from that point on, I think by the time I got to high school, I was like, I want to be an architect, and was on my way from that point on.
So the question is, when you were a kid taking things apart, did you put them back together?
As best I could. There was like always the invariable loss of a screw. That's why I said to my parents' chagrin, sometimes the TV didn't quite work right afterwards, or the stereo cassette player would no longer function that well. But yeah, I certainly made every attempt.
Well, you got to push your boundaries even as a kid.
Right,
You know?
yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. So you go to the University of Florida, I believe, to study architecture. And one question we always ask, which I find interesting, is that when you started architecture school, was there anything about it that you found to be surprising or different from your expectations, if you had any expectations?
Really, very much so. You know, I will admit, I didn't really have much exposure to what architecture was growing up. Even, you know, from high school thinking, I want to be an architect. My world was pretty small in terms of the architectural examples I was exposed to. And I specifically remember some of those very early classes, my freshman year of like architectural history, seeing things like falling water, and in particular, the Barcelona Pavilion. That was like opened my world up. I mean, Barcelona Pavilion was, I think, one of the most instrumental kind of light bulb moments as a young kid in architecture school of what's possible. Just again, the notion of transparency and these floating planes, and it was like nothing I had ever seen. And that really kind of like broke the box open for me, and moved well beyond what I thought like architecture could be or was. And, you know, shortly after freshman year, you know, I kind of like, I couldn't get enough. I was just totally fascinated with it. And the notion of not only a technical craft, but something that was creative. I think my presumption was it was largely a technical craft. I had an internship in high school, and, you know, you made drawings and blueprints and these kinds of things. But they were for relatively traditional homes and other things like that. It was really in those formative college years at University of Florida that the creative side of what architecture is really got its hooks in me.
That's fascinating. I guess because we've been all practicing as architects for so long, I've kind of forgotten how radical the Barcelona Pavilion was, and would appear to be from a student's perspective. Because when you come into when you're an 18-year-old or 17-year-old, probably your definition of architecture is, as a house, let's say, as an example, right, is kind of 4 walls, a porch, a front door, and a pitched roof, or something like an office building is a bunch of windows and a grid. And that's kind of it. And maybe some historical architecture, but yeah, the Barcelona Pavilion literally blew up the box, opened the box.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways. I mean, where are the doors? Questions like that. You don't have to have doors, you know, things like that. And again, just the kind of soaring cantilevers and these floating almost planes in movement was just nothing I'd really ever seen before. And it was definitely influential.
So you finished your time at the University of Florida, then you practiced for a number of years actually before getting your master's.
Yeah, I worked down in South Florida for a couple of years at a few different practices down there, and with the intent, like I knew I wanted to move to New York. All the architectural heroes and practices that I looked up to, they all seemed to be in New York. So, you know, my time down there was certainly beneficial in my early education as a young architect, but I always knew like I want to get to New York. I want to save enough money, and that's where I want to go. And it took me a little longer than I thought, but eventually I moved to New York in 2000, and I worked at several firms there before going to grad school. I worked at Dean Wolfe Architects with Catherine Dean and Chuck Wolfe. And that was, again, a fantastically creative practice, a really great group of not only mentors in Catherine and Chuck, but the colleagues that I was around. It was other people who really shared my passion for architecture and design. And, it was a great experience. And then I worked at ENIAD, which at the time was Polshek. And that was also a really incredible experience, quite different in that it was a large firm. It was my first exposure to what it's like to work in a 100+ person firm.
Wow, they were that large.
Yeah, I think, maybe just over 100 at the time. But, for me, having worked at places that had, at most 10 people, it was quite a different experience. And, I was funny. I was just talking with someone about this last night. Like, one of my lasting impressions from there is that you were surrounded by all these people that seem to love a challenge in one way or another. It's just like, in hindsight, you can kind of say what your experience was like and what the people were like, but it was always like up for a challenge, a technical challenge, a formal challenge. And whether they were design or technical, you were just surrounded by people that were really good at their craft and really committed to their craft. And, I obviously got exposure to bigger, more sophisticated buildings and technical systems, whether they were curtain walls and things like that. And so those were some, again, formative years in between undergrad and grad school. And probably like my plans to go to New York, I never set out to take 5 years off in between undergrad and grad school. It just kind of, that's how life happened. And when I did go back to grad school at Princeton, I found that time served me really well. I had a much different appreciation for the creative liberties and that you get in a studio. Having spent the last 5 years working in a practices, and dealing with things like budget and code and, a lot of the constraints that don't exist in a studio, that I appreciated the latitude and sort of almost singular focus that studio time allows you to have, and really driving design, clarity of design, rigor of your concepts. And so I think it really served me well. I had a lot of energy going back into grad school. I felt really recharged and excited to be there. So it was, and Princeton was an amazing experience for me as well. I mean, again, just to be surrounded by the faculty and students that I was around, and the atmosphere there, and the drive, and it's a relatively small school, so you do get a lot of you get to know the faculty quite well, and you feel like you get quite a lot of time with them. And was there for a couple of years, and I think it was a good counterpart to my undergrad experience. I had heeded some encouragement from professors from undergrad when they suggested, try to find something that's not quite like what you did here in undergrad, try to find a complementary part, maybe something that's even going to be a challenge for you. And at University of Florida, it was very, it was obviously very design oriented. It was kind of compositional basics. I learned a lot about my craft And I feel like with Princeton, it also brought in the kind of conceptual rigor.
Yeah.
And it was a nice counterpart, and I think I would give that advice, and I do, to a lot of younger staff and others that may be contemplating grad school. What are you looking for, and how is it going to not just be part two of what you did in undergrad? Like, you're already good at that. You're good at that.
Do more of
Challenge
that.
yourself with something different.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really well put. I love that description of grad school for yourself, because I've heard consistently from a lot of folks that who have done architecture at the graduate level suggest that you have a break, like a good break between undergrad and grad, of somewhere between 2 to 5 years. People often say 5 is kind of the max, maybe 6 years, but once you get to 7 years, it's too big of a gap. But I really love that you found having that break of 5 years was productive for several reasons, but one of them being that when you got back to school, you were recharged and energized, and you had an appreciation for it. I think, I was talking with some family members the other day who are not architects, and I think there's an assumption a lot of people make where they think, okay, because you practice, now you're going to take all that practical knowledge and put that into grad school, which can be the case. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. But I like the angle you took, and what it meant for you is to just appreciate the special space of being dedicated to a school project and thinking conceptually and all those things. Because for sure, all of the friends we've ever had who graduated from an undergraduate school and then practiced for 5 years, they're all yearning to get back to doing some kind of schoolwork, or they want to be critics on reviews. They want to be back into that space.
Yeah, it certainly shifted my mindset from, oh, geez, I got to be in the studio all day to like, wow, I can't believe like, I just get to do this all day, and I don't remember feeling that in undergrad.
Yeah. Well, it's also the difference, I think, between those two levels of education too, is that everyone who's at a graduate program, they've like really chosen to be there. Yeah, you're not talking about a 17 or 18-year-old that, their parents said, yeah, you're going to do to college, and there's not a lot of thought put into it. Like, you're electing to be there, and it's a very different thing. So you finished grad school, and we want to get to the core subjects and the interesting ones, which have to do with neurodiversity and your ideas of fixed variation. The audience is probably like, what the heck are you guys talking about? So kind of zooming forward to your current position, the current office that you're at, and what you do with the terms I just mentioned, I guess a way to ease into that whole subject matter is, well, first of all, what is neurodiversity? And how did it, again, become a focus for you? When was it first introduced to you as something that would bleed into architecture? How did that unfold?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, in terms of my career trajectory, neurodiversity and the focus on it relative to design has been a rather recent one, probably over the last 5 years. Effectively, neurodiversity, what is it? It really is just recognizing that the diversity encompasses human brains and minds, that we all have different cognitive, not only abilities, but cognitive makeups in our mind. And I think the thing that I really was drawn to about it is its connection to a broader topic in design right now, just in inclusion. Neurodiversity really positions like the mindset of, instead of regarding large portions of the public as suffering from some kind of deficit or impairment in their mental processing, which I think we've long been conditioned to think about, neurodiversity really embraces that these are simply just differences in cognitive function. There is a whole range of the cognitive spectrum that relates to our literacy, our social aptitude, a wide variety of things. And rather than seeing certain conditions as impairments or disabilities, beginning to think about and thinking about them as things that need to be fixed. Instead, how do we start to think about accommodations? What are the support that structures that are required, whether in design, which is my area of focus, or in things like HR policies, hiring, things like that. And so we had gotten involved in the topic as part of a project that we did with Smith College that I started back in probably 2021.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And I think what's interesting too is the way you think about the subject of neurodiversity as belonging to and part of the larger conversation of inclusivity. Mm-hmm. Because we were talking before I hit the record button, then you were remarking that when we think of inclusivity and designing architecture that is for different types of people, we first think about the ADA compliance and the physical differences between people. But It's a really interesting point that, at least in architecture to date, the neuro differences are not really thought about. Not really as much as the physical differences, for sure.
Well, it's not visible to the eye necessarily, so I think
part of it.
It's a little bit harder to maybe for people to think about or remember.
Yeah, I think Marina makes it a great point, and it's one that we talk about in speaking with folks on this subject. Like we tend to think of things like disabilities as the ones that you can see, and those are generally physical, right? Whether they're affecting mobility, vision, auditory, they're generally thought of as like, yeah, it's that. But the reality is there is larger, from a statistical standpoint, prominence of what some consider disabilities that are affecting cognitive mental conditions. And as architects, they've been, I think, long overlooked. There's certainly the progression since the late 60s, 70s, and starting to think about accessible design, the development of ADA, universal design, which has evolved over those years, but they're largely been focused on physical, barrier-free design, things around mobility. And it's, I think, only more recently that this notion of inclusivity or the aspects of universal design that aren't necessarily related to physical issues with space are starting to be considered. And I think that's where you're seeing with like this topic of neurodiversity, which is being discussed more over the last few years, starting to take shape. And we're beginning to have some more awareness around the sensory aspects of the spaces we make, not just the physical characteristics. And that, for me, I think is an important piece of like, well, okay, so neurodiversity, cognitive abilities, like how does it relate to spaces and how we design them? And it's the sensory issue is really the key for a lot of folks that are considered neurodivergent. They generally have some level of difference in sensory processing. And you can have they're most typically like what you would call over responsive or under responsive. Over responsive individuals, and you see this a lot with things like autism and other conditions that are often considered in the neurodiversity umbrella. Certain sensory stimulus that a neurotypical person may pass off as like, yeah, it's background, can have a very outsized impact on their state of being. Much more than what you would think of as like a distraction. These are almost physiological reactions, increase in blood pressure, irritability, kind of akin to what we might consider like anxiety or even to the level of panic attack. And when you think about that relative to students or workers, you get in that kind of state your ability to focus and be productive is severely compromised.
Yeah.
And so it naturally leads one to start to think about the sensory aspects that go on in spaces. If you're saying, well, how do we become more sensitive? How do we take an approach to design that considers the needs of this community? It's largely based on sensory issues. And one of the key things that we try to do is find ways to mitigate common distractions. There's a lot of environmental distractions that are related to vision and sound, whether it's background noise or things like glare, high contrast with patterns,
Really?
and high contrasting color palettes, reflectivity. Now, I'm first and foremost like a design person. Design has always been my thing within architecture, and I've certainly seen and even used reflectivity as a design element, right, to enhance an environment. So they're not inherently bad things. It's just when you take on the perspective of thinking about the spatial needs that better support, I think, a neurodiverse community, these things start to take on a different consideration. And so a lot of our work related to this is around, how do we mitigate some of these sensory distractions, background noise with HVAC, controlling that, providing better acoustics so that the speech clarity is enhanced. When we think about color and pattern, more subdued palettes or color focuses that are a bit more conducive to promoting focus, giving folks social environments. Big crowds can be really distracting as well. So thinking about how do you introduce kind of like release valves in a way to get away from a crowd and things like
release
that.
Valves.
So there are a variety, I think, sort of simple, really, kind of toolkit that architects and designers can utilize to, design space with better sensitivity to some of these sensory issues that are at play.
It's very interesting what you're just mentioning, because I think it clearly outlines the fact that whatever space we design for whoever it is, it will impact them directly or indirectly throughout their human senses, right? And I think that's kind of the ultimate example of the types of project and work that you guys do is you're actually studying that very deeply and see the cause and effect and how we can kind of like plan and dial that in a little bit. It also sounds like the solutions or the things that you're looking at in terms of design could actually be beneficial, not just for people who are, neurodiverse, right?
Yeah.
Could be beneficial for everybody. And in a way, I think that's very interesting because, again, if we go back to ADA requirements and grab bar and ramps and things, those feel more like obstacles and things that maybe just really speak to certain types of users. Where really, looking at reflective materials and patterns and colors and things like that, or even sound, to me, just sounds like we're trying to build an environment that is more pleasing and more comfortable and more in tune with our human senses, no matter if you're neurodiverse or not. It seems to me that it should be pushed and encouraged on every single project anyway, because it sounds like a great thing.
Are the things you're talking about also specifically for educational environments? Is this where it stemmed from with the Smith College?
Certainly our research came from that trajectory, but it's really, these are universal principles that apply to a workplace, for example. The sensory issues are not unique to students. So I think, again, it's a great sort of toolkit approach for architects and designers when considering, like, how are we going to be more inclusive with our design approach to take in considerations of a variety of users, including neurodiverse. And I think, again, to Marina's point, she brings up a really important aspect that I feel strongly about, is that following the kind of mindset around neurodiversity, and that we're all operating on some level of a cognitive spectrum. There isn't a good, bad, that we don't want to try to create spaces for neurodiverse learners or neurodiverse workers. I think that kind of goes against the grain. We're all on this on some level, and inclusive means that it needs to work for a range of types. I think about like early universal design, or even like engineering from the 50s and 60s. This notion of design for the average, you've probably seen in architectural handbooks, the little pictures of people with reach and height and things like that. And we're kind of like conditioned to design for the average. And what we're now starting to talk about is consider the extremes as well. But you don't want to just design for those, because then I think it like reinforces this kind of like almost segregation model. Like there's a class for these over here, and for you got to go over here. That's really not inclusive, in my opinion. We need these spaces to operate for a range, whether you're neurotypical or neurodivergent. And I think that's where, striking the balance. A lot of what I mentioned doesn't necessarily disrupt or become problematic for a neurotypical person. And that's really, in our practice, our goal in thinking about inclusive design, whether it's focused on neuro-inclusiveness or not, that we need to start thinking about design accommodating a range of needs, that this space works better for all of us. To me, that's inclusive, not specialty spaces for specialty needs.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because when you think about, because so much of what we do, designing buildings or designing interiors, designing environments, is a response to a set of factors. And certainly the user group is a big part of that, probably the central one a lot of times, and then the site. But if you think about the user in the way you're describing as this spectrum of different people from one end of it all the way to the other, that actually makes the design approach much more, it changes the equation, actually. It's different then. It's like fundamentally different from, Corbusier's whatever modular man, or whatever things we were taught in school to kind of follow. It really opens up, I think, the design thinking and the possibilities of design much more, because now there's a bunch of different people we have to think about when we're, drawing whatever space.
Yeah, and while it may be kind of a newer way to consider a design approach, I think as architects, we are fundamentally built for this kind of assessing of different priorities, balancing constraints. We do that all the time with other topics, structure versus code, this versus cost. You're taking in a range, right, of often competing factors when you formulate a project's design. And you have to make judgments on balancing those and accommodating those, some to lesser or greater degrees. And this really isn't different than that. That's effectively what it is. It's just maybe a different set of criteria that we're bringing to bear on how these spaces take shape and who they're serving.
So you mentioned that the neurodiversity kind of like focus and topic came about with was it the Smith College project?
Yeah.
Can you explain to us, like, how were you guys approached for this project? What was the project brief? Was this something that was part of the brief, or is that something that you kind of uncovered as you were going through developing the project?
Yeah, they approached us with, submit a proposal for a project that was an active learning environment for 60 to 70 students that needed to accommodate neurodiverse learners. The brief was very brief, and immediately was like, wow, what is this? this sounds really interesting. We got the project, and to kind of tell the story, I think you have to rewind a little bit before we actually got involved. Smith had gone through a strategic plan probably 3 or 4 years previously to us getting started on this project. And one of the core principles of that was an emphasis on face-to-face learning and really promoting the best classroom experience that they could. And so that was a fundamental charge. And they knew they had deficiencies, not only in their assets in terms of like, we simply don't have enough of this size or this type of classroom, but across the campus, kind of the state of those classrooms, not really matching current pedagogy and teaching approaches. And so they were well on their way. They had formed a classroom committee to start to look at this. They were working with their learning center, and they were kind of building a coalition of voices that were shaping how they were going to approach modernizing their classroom assets. Along the way, there was some folks from Smith that had gone to a conference out in California and saw a gentleman named Jeff Ashley speak. And Jeff was, I think he was the director of the Center for Teaching and Learning at Thomas Jefferson University. And he gave this talk on active learning environments and on the topic of neurodiversity. And it really ignited a spark that was brought back to Smith. And that set really the train in motion on them recognizing, hey, we know we have a community of neurodiverse learners on our campus. And as we think about how we redevelop our classroom assets, how are we going to provide spaces that respond to their needs? And that's kind of the time that we got involved. And we're in the early stages of that process was this incredible series of workshops and stakeholder engagements that included not only faculty that would be teaching in this space, but researchers from other areas. Jeff Ashley came and talked about the work they were doing at Thomas Jefferson University, and we had researchers from an array of departments within Smith that, whether it was physical therapy or education, that were kind of tangentially involved in this topic, all like shaping this really amazing conversation. Not to mention actually meeting with and hearing from, neurodiverse students at Smith. And that was probably, speaking with those students was, for me, the most eye-opening part of the early journey. And like, how are we going to design a space to work for them? Because when you like walk the campus with them or walk into a classroom and just listen to them, their reactions to things and things that I would have it wouldn't have caught my attention in the least. To hear the kinds of reactions was really influential in shaping our thinking. Research certainly played a role in it. At the time, there was plenty written on the topic of neurodiversity, but as it relates to physical spaces, there was not a lot. So I think between faculty, researchers, and the students there, that was hugely instrumental in guiding our thinking in the early stages of the project. And that's kind of where this concept that you mentioned before of fixed variation emerged out of that research and out of those early workshops.
What were some examples, if you can recall, of the things that those students were very aware of that they were reacting to that for you didn't even notice in the moment? Do you remember?
Oh yeah. I mean, one of them was predictability.
Predictability.
Yeah, or lack thereof. I should really focus the lack of predictability. So for example, a student would say, I open the door, I come into the classroom. It's not the way it was set up the last time I was here. And this is not good.
Really?
It's almost, again, I go back to kind of like anxiety and that sensation of like a panic, it sets them off in an over responsive state like that. Mm-hmm. This is not what I thought. This was not the way it was the last time I was here. Probably for many of us, not particularly unsettling. You could keep going on about your day and whatever you meant to do. But for some of these students, something like that puts them into, another state that is takes a while to kind of recover from, and certainly doesn't prime you for optimal focus or
sure.
learning. Other things were, related to sound. Someone gave me this kind of explanation of like, imagine if you had all these bug bites and all you could think about in the class was like, I just need to scratch. I just need to scratch. Like that's, it feels like it's a perpetual bug bite. You're not focused on what someone is really saying. You're not in your optimal state to learn when you have this thing that's on you, whether it's the HVAC sound or the glare coming from the window. Again, things I probably saw as like, yeah, it's a mild distraction. I kind of don't like that. But I can generally go about my business at hand if that was the case. And so they were really, really eye-opening. And, again, we talk about in our work on this and sharing with other architects and planners and such, the need to balance things like flexibility in a space with predictability. Mm-hmm. Flexibility is something we hear about all the time. I'm sure you do too. We need the space to be flexible. It's got to accommodate, different type of program variations, and that's important. But what you often don't think about is like, well, what does that mean for predictability? And one of the common ways we see flexibility, particularly in a classroom setting, accommodated is like with a modular furniture approach, right? I'm sure you've seen those where you can set it up this way, you can set it up that way, you can spread them out, everything moves. It's super flexible. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but it's also wildly unpredictable. And even the faculty, which weren't necessarily coming from a neurodiversity perspective, would often, if I come into the room and I have to spend the first 10, 15 minutes setting it back up, it's really disruptive to my teaching approach. That again was one of the like pillars of thought around fixed variation. And how do you create variation in a space without it being infinitely mobile or flexible in the traditional sense, like it can always change? Because
No, go ahead. And now a quick break to thank the sponsors who support the second studio. We are supported by Enscape. Enscape is a real-time visualization and VR tool for the AEC industry. It is also a program that we use in our office. And we like it because, one, it's a plugin and not a separate application, which means we can work natively in our modeling programs, such as Revit, SketchUp, Rhino, ArchiCAD, or Vectorworks. Two, it's super easy and versatile. We've used many other rendering programs, and a lot of times they're just difficult to use. That's not the case with Enscape. We can do renderings, 360-degree panoramas, videos, and immersive VR experiences with a breeze. Thirdly, it renders in real time, so we can see the light, shadows, and materials of the renderings as we're working. So start your free trial today by clicking the Enscape 3D link in our show notes.
One of the easiest ways to get accurate existing condition drawings for houses is with an iPhone or an iPad app called Canvas. Canvas is a tool we use on many of our projects. Instead of surveying a home manually, we simply scan it using our iPad, and Canvas processes the scan to produce accurate drawings and even 3D computer models. The file format works with AutoCAD, Revit, ArchiCAD, Vectorworks, SketchUp, and others. It is extremely easy to use, fast, and really has been a huge benefit for us and our clients. Try it out by visiting canvas.io/SSP and get your first as-built free.
Fellow architects and interior designers, if you are looking to elevate your workflows, then we suggest using the BIM computer program ArchiCAD. ArchiCAD leads the industry by enabling architectural and interior design firms around the world to freely design, supported by innovative technology that expands as far as the imagination can stretch. As ArchiCAD continues to evolve with technological advances, architects can push that technology to their advantage while working in an accurate model. Start your fully functioning free trial today by clicking on the ArchiCAD link in our episode notes.
The second kind of aspect that forms this idea around fixed variation and is really significantly important, I think, in the discussion about how you approach neuro-inclusive spaces is the issue of choice. Providing users, whether it's in a classroom or in a work setting, wherever it may be, the agency of choice is hugely powerful. It's creating options and opportunities for individuals to decide what works best for them. Where do I learn best? Where do I work best? Where do I focus best? That has not been how classrooms or office spaces are traditionally thought about. You think about a classic classroom example, like a tiered lecture hall. Mm-hmm. Your choice is you can sit in the front or the back. You can sit in the middle or close to an aisle. That's it.
Yeah.
And so the ability to promote choice, to provide choice, I can come into an environment and there's that kind of table to the left, or there's this kind of room to the right. That's where I thrive. That I think is one of my favorite parts, certainly from the research and ultimately the design approach, that came out of our work and the project at Smith was, how do we do that? And in the case of the classroom at Smith, again, rather than focused on reconfigurable furniture options and things like pods or other things, we developed a planned concept that at its core had a pretty traditional active learning environment, 360-degree views.
What is an active learning environment for any architects who do not design educational spaces?
Yeah, no, it's great question. You hear it often, also active learning, collaborative learning, team-based learning. So it's really reflective of a change in pedagogy from lecture style, right? You have someone at the front of the room talks for an hour, everybody's jotting down notes. It's one way. Mm-hmm. Active learning is, or team-based learning, breaks down a big room usually into smaller groups of 6 to 8 at tables and has a much more dynamic approach. There's no front of the room usually. The idea is that 360-degree, you have sight lines to the professor, the content. Oftentimes that faculty member is in the middle of the space, moving around through the space, and the format is more of a much shorter duration of what you would consider like lecture format, right? Projecting content, and then breaking it down into team exercises around what was the content, how do you solve this problem? So from an architectural sense, those spaces usually lack a traditional front of the room. There are, again, 360-degree sight lines. All 4 sides of the space are sort of seen as fronts without a hierarchy to them. So that's kind of the typology.
Gotcha.
The project at Smith has that at its core, that is there. But what distinguishes it is there's peripheral spaces on the perimeter that allow students to choose whether do you want to learn in this group setting, social setting, larger space, or you can choose to kind of go in these, we call them alternate classrooms. They're smaller rooms. They have different types of furnishing in each one to, again, promote different sense of preferences, whether it's, standing, soft seating, small group, group of 6. And they have sight lines that allow you to still look out, see the broader class, see the faculty member. But they offer other elements of choice like privacy. They have pivoting walls that, if you want to have your room wide open to the broader audience, you can. You want to pivot the wall and have it mostly obstructed and feel a little bit more private, because that's how you learn better. You can do that too. The technology in those rooms is such that they can hear just as well. They can project their own voice out to the room, and they can see with monitors in those spaces not only what's out on the monitors in the broader classroom, but they can project their own content out there. And I think, from a basic typology, that's the most unique deviation in the space that is at Smith. There are other, breakout spaces, and many classrooms now have that, where, okay, we learned as a group, you can kind of go as a group of 10 over here and work on a project. Those are included in that, but I think what really distinguishes it are this element of choice, the freedom to move about, select the environment that works best for you, and creating enough variety in those environments that is fixed. Like, it's not about moving. That one alternate classroom is always going to have the soft seating that has X, Y, and Z color. The other one always has the stand-up seating. So that's kind of, when we talk about fixed variation, it's combining the notion of personal choice with predictability.
I think your description. I think I've seen the plan of what you've described. I know there's an article you wrote, and there was a plan graphic in there. We will probably get that from you and stick it on this video during this portion of the conversation so people can see it. But your description, there's a couple questions I had, or one was an observation. It sounds like the way the room or rooms were laid out, it gets back to what you were saying before about having, again, fixed zones that are dedicated for different preferences or ways of learning, but they're not fully segregated, because they still overlap into the one kind of central space, or have sight lines, or voice projection lines. So it's still shared, even if they are their own thing. And I think that was something you said earlier in the conversation of finding ways to accommodate and design for a diverse set of people. But again, we're not trying to totally partition them out as being completely segregated, but there's an overlap.
Yeah, I think, probably when you were in school, in elementary school, certainly for me, students that had unique needs relative to learning, it was like they went to another class with another teacher. Yeah. They were over there. And, I think that's kind of very counterproductive to the mindset around neurodiversity. And the point is, no, there's not a special place for these learners. We're all learning together, and we're all in the same place. It works for you. It works well for me. You have the agency of choice to say that this part of the room, that's where I learn best. That's where I'm going to go. And it's not seen as like down the hall in some other space, away from everything, So we were very conscientious in trying to find that balance with how to approach designing something like this.
I was going to ask you about remote learning, and it sounded like your description of the kind of, I don't know what you call it, the learning space that's on the periphery that was the most different, actually utilized some of the virtual learning tools, but in a close proximity setting, if that makes sense. I think you mentioned that there's a screen or computer or something in that small room that broadcasts to the main room, which is adjacent to it. Is that what you were describing?
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
And a lot of these types of active learning or team-based learning environments, because the students will go take a lesson and then work on something for a bit in the course of one class, they often are from their laptops projecting, let's see team two's assignment, and they'll bring it up on screen. So this notion of kind of content projection is fairly common with that pedagogy. And we wanted the users that chose these alternate classrooms on the periphery to have like these same abilities as everyone else. There shouldn't be you chose that room, so you kind of get some of the tech, but you can't do this.
Right.
Again, that's counterintuitive to the inclusivity. So yes, they're able to not only have monitors in there that they can see what everybody else is seeing on the monitors in the main classroom, but again, project content. And we recognize that, if you're a student in that space and you want to contribute to the conversation without some microphones, it's going to be hard. So, there are microphones and speech amplification so that those students that are in the main space can hear the students that they might not even be able to see just fine.
That's really cool.
And there's other aspects of, closed captioning. It can be included on the monitors. Again, some people are just visual learners. So trying to bring all of the same amenities and abilities that students in the main room would have to these alternate classroom spaces was a big priority for us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's really fascinating to think about. I mean, basically what you're doing also is using these different types of technologies and space planning and whatnot to find different ways to mediate inputs and outputs by different degrees, which I think is really cool. Because when you think about broadcasting, and it's been a while since I've been in a classroom, so maybe this is standard and I'm just ignorant. But when you think about broadcasting, you think about Zoom, like we're doing now. And that's very clear why it's taking place. But using it when you're right next to each other for the sake of toggling again and mediating how much is coming in and coming out and what is coming in and coming out is pretty fascinating.
Did you? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
You had mentioned the kind of remote learning, and obviously in the pandemic that was a necessity, and it sort of for a lot of universities I think opened up a new chapter in terms of ability, but one of the interesting components of that relative to the neurodiverse community of learners is there was a disproportionate amount of neurodiverse learners across campuses that sort of stayed in the remote learning model, even when you could come back to campus. And again, I think probably things around some of these preferences and choices that don't necessarily exist. They may have found that I learn better here, because there's not X distraction or there's not this. And one of the things we're tracking with the project at Smith, because it's a pilot classroom effectively. There's a lot of, these are great ideas. How will they actually work? Will they produce the intended results? And one of them is around in-person attendance with the classroom. Is that driving the students that were staying at home, opting to continue in a remote learning model to come back to the classroom? Again, Smith's focus is really on face-to-face education. They want to promote those students coming back and feeling comfortable and finding spaces on campus, whether classroom or not, where they can thrive. So I always thought that was an interesting part of the research to know that they were, you could say, I guess, disproportionately affected, and that you could see that something about the physical environment is keeping them from coming back. How do we level that playing field?
Yeah, that was actually one of my questions, is are you able to, like you said, track basically or measure the success of this new type of design now that the classrooms in the school is being used, and
and compare it to maybe previous data with the previous space and see like how things are kind of like, going one direction or the other, or which of those design solution is more effective maybe versus some others?
Yeah, it's a big effort, Marina, that we're underway in now, the kind of post-occupancy feedback in a way. And we've certainly gotten the kind of anecdotal of like, this spaces work great. It's my favorite for this, or even, like, this is a terrible space to give a lecture in. And it's true, that space is not really well suited for a traditional lecture front of the room. It's got these giant columns in it that just don't really work for that. So matching the pedagogy to the space is always important. But yes, we are underway on more of a, I guess, empirical kind of feedback effort in terms of tracking things like in-person attendance, test scores, other metrics that Smith is interested in. I think, and some partially from a student performance, student success standpoint. And we are clearly interested, in some of the aspects of like, well, did the space help them? Are they using it the way we thought they might? There have been students that have said like, wow, the technology in here is incredible. Like, I come in here and I figured out how to put my iPod on and I got music going, and it's a cool little study space where no one bothers me, so there's also adaptations of how it's being utilized that, like any space, you can't fully imagine or appreciate right when you first conceive them. So that's something we're really interested to see how it pans out. It needs some time. They've had 2 full semesters in the space so far, and the first one last fall, the class, it had just come online. So with the registrar, there wasn't a lot of classes that were scheduled for it, and now this last semester that just wrapped up, I think it's been utilized a lot more. So we're curious about that. And, like a lot of our work here at our office, that kind of feedback guides how we think about the next project and build upon, things that went well and sometimes things that didn't go well. It's design is a feedback loop. And that, just finishing the project, closing it out, getting the photos is never really the end. In my opinion. I mean, there's so much still of to be learned on how people are actually using it, and that guides future thinking.
I think that the post-occupancy, feedbacks is oftentimes a thing that either, architects don't get to really receive, depending on the type of project that they work on. Or sometimes they do, but it's, it doesn't always happen. And I do wish that something that would be a dedicated phase of the project life is that, because there is a lot that we can learn from the work that we've just completed by it being used. So I think that's very important. That was going to be actually my next question is, have you guys implemented some of those strategies on other schools and colleges since the Smith project?
Or other projects.
Or other types of projects even, like not educational necessarily.
Yeah, we have, to various degrees. I would say one of the things that we're seeing, I think there's a lot of overlap with workplace design, and that's a big component studio in our practice. The notion of kind of like developing an ecosystem, right, of choice, of opportunities for people to find the environment that works best for them, that even as before the pandemic really hit, we were already seeing a transition in workplace design from a fixed notion of, I come in, this is my desk, I sit here for 8 hours and I do my thing. Maybe I have to go to a meeting in the conference room. And that was it. It was already starting to change, and I think it's changing more towards, again, elements of choice, the notion of mobility, different. We've clearly seen from the pandemic that you do not need to be parked at a desk with a lot of the, presumed equipment that you need to work effectively. And we've started to look at in our design process a bit what we've been calling them sensory overlays. I don't know if that's the right term at the moment, but when we think about programming, I'm sure you've done them, seen them, a lot of bubble diagrams when you first start a space that deal with the program in terms of its physical characteristics. I need a conference room that's this big. We're going to need offices here. We need this. And you kind of bubble it out and lay out a space based on physical aspects of the program. We've started to do similar kind of diagrams that look at the sensory allocation of a space from a visual. Where can people have choices for dim and bright? How is that distributed? Where can there be loud and quiet zones? And how is that distributed? What about social, with crowds in a collaborative atmosphere, and then with private? And again, it's this sort of balancing. Do those considerations and their associated allocation and space complement the program? Do they work well with the program? So not just thinking about how we lay out space, whether it's on a university project or a workplace design, simply from the physical characteristics of the space. So we've been adapting it a bit in our process. I find that we are asking more questions in our pinups around topics of not only inclusion, but equity and wellness, just as a matter of best practice. I think we are we're very much a mission-driven company, and our mission really focuses on how we leverage our talents and abilities with design to make positive impacts to our clients, to our community, to the broader planet. And so it's been really exciting to see that shift occurring in things like our in-office pinups and the kinds of questions that we're asking and trying to solve. It's much broader than it was 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think I see things like the AIA's framework for design excellence, for example, taking a similar direction where we're looking beyond aesthetics to understand what is good design. Aspects of sustainability and wellness shouldn't be thought of as extra. Well, you could have a good design project, or it could be sustainable. Not really. Or how can you really claim it's a great design if there's really no consideration of community or inclusion or equity? And so we're certainly wrestling with and embracing a much broader set of considerations in design beyond just the aesthetics, with the intent to this project should make an impact in a strong way, not just be a beautiful piece of architecture or a really engaging or compelling visual space. And that's been admittedly like a transition for me on a personal level, because as I said, I was a design capital D person. Those considerations of aesthetics and form and were the things that originally excited me and were got me going. And I think that will always be an element not only of my own approach to design, but architecture in general. But now expanding that a little bit to ask, like, what does that form do? Like, why is it that beyond it? Well, it looks great. The proportions are fantastic.
Right, right.
These kinds of the aesthetic vocabulary is I don't want to say taking a backseat, but it's certainly now being discussed in a much broader vocabulary with a lot of different considerations.
Yeah, more considerations. That's really fascinating. when you were speaking, it occurred to me that I feel like this is a generalism, one of the things that a lot of architects tend to do is I think we like to think about things in a very kind of bird's eye view regarding form and aesthetics. And we tend to be very kind of calculating sometimes. Here's the program, as you mentioned, or here's the structural grid, or here's the part T, and everything's very rationalized in that way. But I do feel like sometimes architects, especially if we talk about the interiors portion of a building, we become more detached from just the basic question of what is it like, what does it feel like to be in the space? For a human being to be in the space, and that human being is categorized as X, Y, and Z person, or all the different ranges of people that exist out there. Like what is the emotional impact it has on them in the space? As opposed to, well, according to the diagram, this has to be red because that thing is red, and this is, tall because that has to be short, and whatever other kind of geometrical rationale that we have behind the thing. And but certainly when it comes to designing any kind of space, especially a workplace or a classroom, that's not enough. That's not enough.
Yeah, and I see that changing in the profession, and I don't think we're the only folks that are starting to take a different tact on these considerations. And again, some of this will always be a part of architecture. There will always be the kind of rational technical side that's there.
Yeah.
And
I'm not saying it shouldn't be there either.
Right.
Yeah.
But we do have to, I think, expand beyond that a little bit, and it's. I think there's a question too of like it in my mind it enhances our value. Mm-hmm. What our value proposition as architects is, if we're exclusively agents of an aesthetic consideration or domain, I think can be limiting. And when we're able to tackle a broader set of problems that have, tangible impacts to people, it repositions our value proposition in a good way, in my opinion, as architects. And so, I often found at early stages of my career, that kind of frustration around, well, why don't they think this is great too? I don't understand it. Like, why isn't everyone calling me or and the idea that everyone agrees with or is engaged and inspired by my particular aesthetic vision is, not necessarily realistic, but it also, I think, diminishes if that's what are we as architects, is simply, the one with the vision for the building. It's also the vision for how we're going to support a broad array of needs, whether they're the users or the community, or zooming out even further, the environment. Yeah. There's a lot of pertinent problems that can be solved, and we're uniquely equipped to solve them. And I think that will help our profession, as we collectively refocus on that and in a way demonstrate our value.
That's super well said. I mean, I think if there's a shift from one way of practicing to this, let's call it this new way, where you're looking at a set of variables that's much wider, it's on the one hand, therefore, maybe a much more daunting task, but incredibly exciting. I do think, and this is pure speculation into the psychology of the average architect, whoever that is, there's perhaps also sometimes a little bit of an ego component to it, right? Whereas if that average architect maybe previously felt like they were the auteur, and I have my logics for what I create that have to do with aesthetics and whatnot, and that's what it is, take it or leave it. That's a very different mindset from a person who says what you're saying, in fact.
Yeah, it is. And, I'll just, since we're talking about it, this project with Smith, that was a co-creation model by design. And the early workshops and the thinking, this was not like, hey, Michael, how about you and your team go back to the shop and we'll see you in 2 months, come up with something great. It wasn't that at all. It was highly, I think there's collaborative, and then there's like the notion of co-creation, right? Where you come into a project knowing like we are all going to share in how this turns out in a substantial way, not like I'm the one because I have some unique ability to craft this thing. Yes, I have a set of skills that allow me to translate certain things into built form, communicate them, all of that. But that's a long way from the architect in the ivory tower, and
Right.
the singular, uncompromising vision. And again, that's co-creation and moving beyond aesthetics. That was not how I was built originally, in a way,
Right.
in the early stages of my career. And so that has been an evolution. And the Smith project was a fantastic, I think, manifestation of like embracing that process and the outcome. When I look at that project, the pictures of it, the designer in me doesn't go, wow, look at that, it's amazing. It's just like, fires all my rocket. It's not like some of the other work that I have created, but it's incredibly gratifying, to know what we've done, and the feedback I've gotten. When I talk about this subject at conferences and such, inevitably, there are many, many people that will come up to me before they hear what the topic is, or after, and say, I'm so glad you're talking about this. I haven't heard anyone talk about this. My son, my daughter, my husband has, it's a lot more prevalent, I think, than we realize, that people are struggling against with like what many consider disabilities, right? That you can't see.
Yeah.
And on a personal level, it's taken on an added level, I think, of gratification for me, because my son, who's 11, he's considered neurodiverse, and he has ADD, and that has been a more recent, over the last couple of years, thing that came to the surface. So I got involved with this earlier. And as he began to struggle in school, and we identified what was going on, just my awareness and sensitivity and the ability to have a mindset about, like, there's nothing wrong with him. This is how his brain works.
Yeah.
Even talking with educators in his school, and it was really, again, the project was hugely gratifying in a way that I don't know if I've had that with some of my other work, even though there's been projects I'm hugely proud of and have received recognition for. I think it just took on a different dimension. And again, to go back to where you started, the away from what probably we think about a lot with like the ego of an architect, and particularly of a designer, that stereotype that exists in our profession.
Is the school your son goes to, is it a good place, or are you tempted to step in and say, let me redesign this classroom for you?
They are interested in talking about that, actually.
Nice.
When I was meeting with some of the folks involved in working with my son, and they heard what I was involved in, for work. It's like, oh my gosh, you got to come out here and talk to us about that. How can we
That's
set
awesome.
things up? And again, a lot of it is not like wholesale. You got to reinvent the school. There are simple, low-hanging fruit about, well, how can you provide choices for these students? Can they get up and move around, right? Can you give them some space to do that? Do they have different seats to choose from? It doesn't all have to be, we're inventing this like utopian vision of a super inclusive school. There's just some basic universal principles around mitigating distraction and promoting choice that will help these students. So yeah, I'm probably will be talking to their board of education at some point, because there's a lot of interest in that.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a great conversation, and it actually makes me think about, when we talk about inclusivity and diversity and how people maybe are left out from the rest of the group and all of those things. It's when you think about it, right? All of this is just made up rules that we invented, right? Once again, like, it's if the majority was diverse, then the minority that is not would be the group that is excluded. So right. What's interesting with thinking in an inclusive way is that it's really about reframing and restructuring things, and then you change the perspective on everything. And I think that's kind of the power and the skills and the magic that architects and designers can do, is that we have this ability to kind of like think about things very differently and present them to the world in a way that is possible and we can execute, but that could still transform and change everything. So I think the work that you're doing with the Smith College and the neurodiversity and the fixed variation and all of those tools are just a proof that we can change the way things have been done so far, and it's just a matter of how we think about them and how we approach them.
Yeah, and I do think it's culturally we're beginning to see a change or in mindset and in recognizing that not only should it really be like a move away from, well, there's problematic and there's normal or atypical and typical kind of thinking, the binary thinking, and that there are recognized strengths in neurodiverse individuals that people are beginning to recognize and actually leveraging them. Companies are recognizing this, that, you would, the potential worker has autism. 10 years ago, it was like, that's not going to work, or because all they can see is the diagnosis side of it, what they commonly think of as the problematic parts. But a lot of a lot of these same individuals have above average skills in certain areas. Particularly the tech industry is jumping on this, because a lot of neurodiverse individuals have above average ability in things like mathematics, pattern recognition, programming, and companies that are embracing this are realizing there are untapped strengths here that will work for our particular industry or focus area. And that's great to see, because I think that community has struggled, whether it's with learning, but particularly with employment opportunities. So to see culturally that we're starting to consider, like, well, yeah, there's a range. There's not problematic and there's not typical. There's just a range. And by the way, there's all kinds of untapped strengths that exist in these individuals.
Michael, this has been a great conversation. The final question we always ask is more of a fun one, but sometimes the most difficult, which is, what is your favorite building? And it doesn't have to be one that you've worked on, although it can be.
Oh, yeah, that is a good one. Stephen Hull's Nelson Atkins Museum has always been one of my personal favorites. I've always enjoyed Stephen Hull's work. And that project in particular, the materiality, the light, the relationship of the site has always been one of my favorites, and probably not surprisingly, based on our early conversation, Barcelona Pavilion.
Nice.
It's definitely up there.
Is the Stephen Hull project, is that the museum that has I think might be channel glass facade?
Yeah.
It's on a green rolling landscape.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's kind of this series of like pavilions, and they're interconnected. And just the kind of experiential qualities, I think, of the light and the facade, and his form making has always resonated with me, and love that project.
Awesome.
Very cool.
Well, thank you so much for making the time on a
David
Wednesday
and Marina,
morning.
Thank you too.
This was great. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, likewise.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to this week's episode. If you like what we're doing, then please support the show by leaving a review of the podcast in the Apple Podcast app. You can also find us on Spotify and YouTube. YouTube is where we have all of our interviews, our project companion and fellow designer episodes where we provide helpful information for clients and other designers and architects and aspiring architects. You can also find us on Instagram. The handle is Second Studio Pod, and we have a pretty good following on there, and we post clips and reels and quotes and guest work images and announcements, and that's what else do we post on there? That's probably about that's like
lately
everything.
We've been posting photos and videos of our latest travel. So if you're curious, just if you don't know where to go, what to do, we also have the hotline. Did you mention that?
No.
213-222-6950. You can send a text message or call and leave a voicemail. If you have any guest suggestions, any topics you want us to talk about, feel free to send your suggestion right there, and we'll look at it.
Beyond that, thank you, everybody, for listening. It means a lot to us, and we have a lot of great guests coming up this year. We're going to keep this going. We're past episode 400. We did nothing special for it. It was just another episode because that's how we're... Maybe
we
when
had
we
James
get to...
Corner on. That was
cool.
That was
for sure,
yeah.
for sure. But we didn't there was no birthday cake or whatever.
As you can tell, we're not really celebratory people.
So maybe when we get to 500, we'll do something.
Yeah. Let's see.
Probably not. All right, that's it. Thanks, everybody. Talk soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.